crosser.
One thing I learned from our lectures in undergrad is that you're good at talking quickly about stuff. And
Oh yeah, you remind me not to talk fast. That's quite true. I had to talk consciously more slowly. That's absolutely right.
Well, people on YouTube, people can change the speed you're speaking.
Can they?
If they're particularly sharp, they can speed you up to 1.5 times speed.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh really? I didn't know. Can anyone do that, or does it require something?
Yeah, you can speed it up or slow
Can
it
you?
down. It makes listening to podcasts.
Where do you do it then? Where's the thing that controls
There's
that?
a little settings button.
Mm.
Bottom, you press it, and then it gives you a choice. I think it's from 0.5, 0.75, 1.35, 1.5,
Really?
1.75, and 2.
Do you know that? That's interesting.
Yeah, it makes watching videos a lot easier if you put them at 1.5 times speed, because you can sort of, if your mind's fast enough, you can take in stuff a lot quicker.
Yes. Oh, absolutely.
I imagine most people will be slowing you down. Then.
Yeah, no, I will speak more slowly. It's absolutely true. I do get that comment from people. I get that comment from students sometimes to speak too fast.
That's why I enjoyed your lectures, because you
Said a lot in the 45 minutes available.
Information dense that you just had to be like on it constantly. Talking. You're like, what's he saying? What's he saying?
I had brilliant training for it because my first lecturing job was in Bezalel in Jerusalem, which is kind of like the Israeli Royal College of Art, basically. And I was speaking in Hebrew, which was a huge effort. Yeah, I sort of formed a bit recently, but I certainly did, and I was teaching in Hebrew, and so I had an audience of people they're all ex-army, right? Because they all do their national service, so they're all sitting there waiting for the strange English person to fall into a trap. You could see kind of hot-looking eyes, looking crossly, waiting for me to fall over. So it was a pretty tough audience to start with, and I had to keep going, and I had to fill. There were hour and a half slots too, so it was a lot.
Lecturers fast in Hebrew to
Not quite. I wrote my notes in English because I knew I'd lose my place if I wrote them in Hebrew. So I wrote it out longhand in English and had it open in English, but spoke to it in Hebrew, and therefore it didn't look like it was read because I wasn't reading it. I was simultaneously translating it, as it were. Yeah. And the brain power required to do this was so massive that I was just asleep for the whole of the following day. Always, it just completely finished me off.
Well, I remember you as a very good lecturer because of the information density.
A lot of information. Well, that's what we try to do.
Well, I was never sure how much of it I was meant to be remembering.
Yeah, well, this is part of it, you see. Nowadays, in the modern era, they say, oh, we have to have notes and we have to have this and we have to have the next thing. And that's not really quite the point. The point is you're meant to be listening and you don't have to remember all of it. It's not like a memory test. You're meant to just get into the general atmosphere of the thing, and you will remember some and you won't remember the others. But that's considered to be a very old-fashioned view nowadays, I can tell you.
Well, it'd be nice if someone set that out at the beginning and be like, you don't have to remember all of this, but
yeah,
as much as you can.
Right.
Anyway, we should talk about why we're here, which is your new book. The Edwardians in their houses, which I will hold up here.
Thank you, Bruce. Yes.
Your new book, with an excellent photograph on it. And we'll talk about that a bit later, and we'll get into it. But first, we're going to go through apprenticeships, which is probably what most people are concerned about if they're thinking about studying architecture or are doing part one and considering doing postgrad. So can you tell us about your new role at Cambridge, what it is, and how it's different to the standard model of architecture?
Yes, what we're talking about, Bruce, is a part two apprenticeship. And it's completely different from anything that has been tried before. We wanted to start from scratch. This initiative came from James Campbell, who was the incoming head of department at Cambridge a couple of years ago. And what we did was this. We didn't want to convert a regular part-time course into an apprenticeship course. We wanted to address what we knew were the problems in postgraduate architectural education right at the start. So the way in which we do it is this. We hold 3 fortnightly intensive residential sessions. They will be residential when the pandemic is over. 3 residential fortnightly sessions a year in Cambridge, in which all our apprentices come together and work in small groups on mostly design projects, although we also have research modules and other aspects of architectural education as well. We put a lot of emphasis on collaborative working and working in teams. We do formal teaching in working in teams. That's partly because we believe that it's a very important contribution to architectural education and practice in any case to have that kind of formal training, but also because our apprentices are working over a very short period of time on a design project. So that's what lies at the basis of it, but that's really only just the start. The great distinction between the apprenticeship model that we're running and what part 2 has looked like in the past is that apprentices then have a number of days per year. It's up to 20% of their whole working year, up to another 12, 14 days or so a year in order to add work to the work that they've done as part of a group at their own speed. This is quite different, isn't it? Because normally when you're a student, there's a project, it has marks, it has a deadline, it has feedback, that's the end of it, it's over. And you spend some time afterwards regretting that you didn't address something that was raised by someone in a crit. It isn't like that with us. With us, you can go on improving it. If you wake up on Christmas Eve suddenly with an idea about something you could have done better, then you can do it and you're going to get recognition from it. So that's the structure. It has monthly supervisions, like all Cambridge graduate courses, I believe. It's this mixture of intensive and then at more or less your own time. But it's also quite different in many other ways. One of the problems with Part 2, with the conventional form of a Part 2, is that it was too far removed from anything that you might be doing in practice. Now, nobody wants to turn a Part 2 into an extension of an office job because it would fail that way, I think, to have the intellectual stimulation that universities can offer. But what is enormously important, I think, is that there is a process by which one's training as a Part 2 apprentice and one's work in practice they intermingle all the way through. It goes backwards and forwards. We found this with the teamwork training. We found, for example, that our apprentices were saying that having learnt both the theory and the practice of how to deal with the dynamics of a small team, that they could take this knowledge directly from the university and apply it in team meetings, design team meetings, client meetings, or whatever in their practice. They could understand better what was going on, and consequently, they could also make more of a contribution themselves earlier on than they might have done in their career. So that's part of it. We see it going backwards and forwards. The other thing, which is a huge change, and one which will take some time, I think, probably before this culture change sinks in, is that at Cambridge, we warmly encourage the employers of our apprentices to come and play a part themselves. We ask for any kind of suggestion about what that involvement might take. Now, some of it is obvious, some of it is slightly less so. An obvious thing might be, for example, coming to a crit and watching everyone at work, including that employer's own apprentice, and getting a picture of what is happening. That's the first thing. The second thing, though, is that we want to involve our employers in teaching events if they want to do that. So, if, for example, we want to make a presentation of some kind, then we want to hear about it. We're very keen for our apprentices' employers to visit the Department of Architecture, to see what is going on, to come and talk to us at the exhibition, which will take place in June when our apprentices are exhibiting together with all the other students in the department. We want everyone to feel part of it. If you are an architectural practice and you're sending an apprentice to us, that apprentice has got direct access to the many research sources of the university, which are enormous in the case of a university like Cambridge. They can use that information in work that they're doing in the office, and it's not going to be detached from reality, the kind of information you can get hold of. The Department of Architecture has a very significant Centre for Material Innovation, for example. Some of those researchers are teaching on our course. That means our apprentices have direct access to them. They can be guided to where the publications are. We have experts in the department, of course, in city planning, in transport, in infrastructure, and so on. And our apprentices are with them and know where to find them. So what we've done is we've thrown everything up into the air, and we've come back with a system where the work in the office and work in the university are mixed. It should be fun. It's produced fantastic results this first year. And of course, it's been very difficult for everyone in this current situation where everyone is compartmentalized into Zoom boxes. So it's extraordinary what people have achieved. And we think that this is what the future will look like. I think as you know, Bruce, I think that there is a place for full-time, traditional postgraduate architectural education for design courses of different sorts, of theoretical or historical courses, which architects might choose to do as a early mid-career activity. That's absolutely right. It's what universities are for to some extent. But the general pattern of how people will train to be architects, in my opinion, will change, and apprenticeships will start to take a much more significant role in the future.
Well, it definitely sounds like a sort of innovative model. I find it interesting, the idea of bringing work from actual real-life practice into what is an alternative model of the part two, effectively. How does that relate in terms of sort of obviously a lot of part twos is a lot of very hyper-theoretical, big thinking work. How do you avoid the trap of effectively bringing a sort of part three style, case study style work into what is a part two? Like, how do you avoid getting a project that's kind of not really ambitious enough or a little bit?
Yes, no, I understand the point. I understand the point you're making. Yes.
How do you stop it from being, I don't know, my part two project is a load of your schedules?
Yes, no, I understand exactly the point that you're making. Well, first of all, your part two project won't be any kind of project that anyone is doing in practice. These are set by leading architects. These projects are set by leading architects in practice who have experience as teachers. So, for example, our urban design module will be run next year by Procter & Matthews, who are both experienced, not only urban designers, but also teachers. And Meredith Bowles of Mole Architecture will be running the module on sustainable building design. So there is no reason to suppose that there is going to be a dull project. The project that our apprentices have just finished, their teaching takes place outside term time, I should say, because they use the facilities that are not being used by the regular undergraduates at the time. So that's why the timing is different. So that means that they finished in mid-April, and they were designing a floating timber structure of a kind that they're unlikely to be required to do in reality. And if they were, it wouldn't be a problem about it being a kind of a workaday project. It's more the methods, and the thinking. We're teaching our apprentices how to research information. That means not only what comes to mind, we say research perhaps for somebody with my background, historical research or architectural history research, but also how to find research into, for example, uses of timber, or how to find research into uses of different forms of transportation, how to find it. And that's the kind of information you can take back to the office. You can bring the office example in as something you might want to test. But in reality, that doesn't really happen, because in the fortnight of these intensive modules, there's not that much time to think about what's going on at work. That's what makes it different. I should say also that this business about the flexibility about when apprentices add work to their own modules, this, as far as I know, this is unique to our course. Generally speaking, apprenticeship courses have been adaptations of part-time courses. So they have a fairly rigid timetable. We don't have that. It's a complicated thing to manage, but that's not the apprentice's problem. The outcome of it is, though, that if you're an apprentice working in a practice where there is suddenly terrible pressure for 3 weeks, which we've all been there, we all know it's like that. 3 weeks would be short, wouldn't it, for that kind of crisis? They haven't got to worry about missing out on their training, because they can make it up later on, and the employer hasn't got to be worried about the person going out of the office every Friday morning. So it doesn't seem to be affected in that way, Bruce. I do recognise what you mean. I mean, let's be honest about it. That's what, in the days of articled clerks, which is what apprentices were called 100 years ago, roughly, that is what they did, wasn't it? They just worked in the office and they did boring office stuff. And the most that they could do was go to lectures, perhaps organised by the AA, for example, to make it more interesting for themselves. That's not interesting. It's not stimulating. University needs to be, I think, perpetually stimulating all the way through, and to make sure that everybody is not just getting something out of it, but that you're faced with this enormous range of activities. And our apprentices are 100% Cambridge graduate students. It's not any kind of second best. It's precisely the same as every other kind of Cambridge graduate student.
And part two verified.
Yes, it's on the way. I mean, it's yeah. I mean, the ARB is currently looking at our final submission for prescription, so that is on the way. It's not surprising that they've taken so long, because these are different. They're a thorough organisation, which is what we all hope that they would be. But it's because it's new, it's taken a bit of time to to work out precisely how to present it and all the rest of it.
Yeah. And how, in terms of the funding of it, so obviously people are used to getting a student loan or some kind, obviously for undergraduate.
Yes.
There are some student loans for part two as well, where you pay for these directly. How does the funding system work differently in the apprenticeship route?
In the apprenticeship route, the government provides a maximum of £7,000 a year to any practice which is paying into the apprenticeship levy. That's a place with a salary bill of more than £3 million a year. But there is access to some funds for practices who do not pay the apprenticeship levy, which at the moment is fairly generous. We don't know what will happen in the future with it, but what we do know is that whatever else you can say about Her Majesty's government, it does support apprentices and it does support higher level apprentices. So at the moment there is access to either all or most of that public funding. Now, Cambridge charges a bit extra for three reasons, essentially. First of all, we provide personal supervisions through the year, apart from the depths of the summer, so that every apprentice has got a personal academic advisor who is helping them complete their work or get ready for the next presentation. That's one thing that we do. Another thing is the flexibility, which does have a number of costs involved in it. And the third thing is this access to this extraordinary range of facilities that the university offers all its graduate students in the form of not only research material of the kind of written sort, but of anything else. For example, our apprentices are on the mailing list for at least 3 sets of lectures, which are organised by the Department of Architecture. The Martin Centre organises lectures that are by and large, a lot of them are sustainability based, but they're by and large more technical. There is a series of architectural history seminars. There is a series of talks by guest architects, which are organised by Ingrid Schroeder, who runs the full-time Part 2 course. We know that by and large, the apprentices are not in the same building as the Part 1 students, but there are Part 2 students around, often around at unusual times, outside term, and anything we can do to bring everyone together will be an advantage for all of us.
Mm. Well, it's definitely sort of an up-and-coming model, isn't it? Like with the government focus on more apprenticeship kind of thing. And I think people were a bit surprised that the Foster one wasn't taken up as quickly as people thought it might be, of going through an apprenticeship route. So what's the sort of hesitation been, do you think, if there has been one?
Well, there is a big commitment. It's clear that the fact that the apprentice isn't paying any fees is an advantage. The Farrell Review a few years back made the point, an important point, and it made it clearly that it's fairly unsustainable for people on architects' salaries to go on building up an increasing amount of debt, theoretical or otherwise. It's still there. It wasn't a model that was going to work on the kind of earnings that young architects were making. So something needed to change from the money point of view. Now, what that means is that an aspiring apprentice needs to find an employer who's sufficiently confident of them and their abilities and their future place in the firm to commit themselves to supporting that apprentice through the 3 and a bit years of the apprenticeship. You do 3-year course, and then there is a bit extra called an endpoint assessment, which coincides with the Part 3. Essentially, it's the apprentice version of the Part 3 that takes about 6 months after the end of the 3 years. So it requires a big commitment from an employer. We've noticed that employers are looking to make those commitments. Now, it's an important thing to say. You mentioned Foster. Foster, of course, is a very big company, but that shouldn't give the impression that apprenticeships are best suited to the large companies which have got behind them the mechanics and the HR department and the administrative ability to put somebody through an apprenticeship, because it isn't only like that. We certainly take apprentices from large companies, from global companies, actually, in some cases. But some of our apprentices come from very small offices, 3, 4, 5 members of staff in total. That might happen when someone who runs a practice has found a post Part 1, they've worked together for a year, and the director of that practice says, well, actually, I don't want to lose this apprentice. I don't want to lose this assistant. I want to keep them here. I want them to feel confident of their career path in this practice. That's when they would send them to a course such as ours. That's exactly it. You haven't lost someone. It's worth saying also that there is a third group of architectural practices who do seem to be particularly interested in apprenticeships, and that is ones who have a specialism of some sort. Because if you work in, for example, one of the major conservation practices as a post-Part 1 assistant, you are in receipt of an enormous amount of intellectual property, as it were. You're hearing a lot of specialist stuff, which carries value wherever you go. You learn how to do that. I mean, we have, for example, at the moment, an apprentice who works in a practice which specializes in buildings for health, for example. This is specialized, valuable, specialized information. And the employers in those circumstances don't want to lose someone to the outside world once they've trained them up over the first year. They want to go on building up that knowledge and directing that person through a career path in the practice.
So the sort of route into it, if you could either be a Part 1 yourself who's already working, and you would approach your employer to say, I'd quite like to do this course at Cambridge, this apprenticeship course at Cambridge. This is how it works. Will you sponsor me? Will you support it? And then they presumably have to go away and work out that it's good for them to do that. And then they would, say, commit to that assistant that they were going to do that in some formal way, I suppose.
Yes, that's exactly what happens. That is precisely what is happening during the course of this. We're just now in the process of looking at the applications for our second year, because we started for the first time ever in September 2020. In many cases, we had extremely motivated applicants who did precisely as you say, Bruce. But we think that it will happen, and it is already beginning to happen, that employers will start looking for someone to take on as an apprentice at the outset, and that will grow. That's precisely the area that will grow. Some practices, if they want to go on attracting the top performing Part 1 graduates, and there are, as we know, there are practices who look straight away to people with a first class Part 1 degree. In order to go on attracting those same people, they may want to offer an apprenticeship route.
So, well, if I was going to say the other route might be that the employer has a Part 1 who they like, who, like say, they might have trained up a lot in a particular specialism or on their particular systems. They don't have to go through all that again, but they know that Part 1's going to want to go and do their Part 2 in the next year or two. They can approach that Part 1 and say, we know you're applying to do these Part 2s. We'd like to, if you want to apply to this apprenticeship scheme, we will support it for you, and therefore you will have a job throughout, and potentially a job afterwards as well. You won't have to worry about applying for jobs elsewhere.
Yes, that's exactly what's happening. And there are, you can see that there are expenses and there are commitments in sending an apprentice to an apprenticeship, but there are also savings. And one of them is you're not re-advertising, re-interviewing, all the rest of it. I mean, you might be, because the company might be taking on people at one end and people might be retiring at the other. In a large practice, there is a bit of that. But there certainly should be some savings on that very basic level, but there should also be big gains for an apprentice employer to make if they want to come and be part of the Cambridge Department of Architecture. This is the way to do it.
So, if you're employer and we're looking at it, what are the sort of financial commitments, and how often are you going to have your Part 1 missing from the office? So on a day-to-day level, how on your sort of bottom line level, how's it going to affect you as an employer? Well,
the main thing was the flexibility that I mentioned earlier. So what that means is that you are going to, as an employer, you are going to lose the apprentice for those 3 fortnights a year. There's no way around that. The apprenticeship, for 3 solid fortnights, you're going to lose them for that. Attendance at the events, at anything to do, all apprenticeship courses, whatever they happen to be, you have to turn up. So that is going to be there. The other days, which will be something between 12 and 16 days, depending on your own working contract, actually, those other days, they can be organized to suit you. So instead of the apprentice taking a day off in January, another one in February, another one in March, right? They can remain at work unobstructed, carrying on with that emergency package that has to be completed. And then at the end of March, say, take 3 days off in a row and deal with building up their portfolio for their apprenticeship. This is the flexibility that we're offering. And we think that this is a very important part of engaging employers with us, that they're not like on the other side of a wall, that there's a university over here and there's an office over there. But in fact, there is a thing going backwards and forwards where you are discussing it, you're not negotiating is too high a word. You're discussing when this is going to take place and how it can take place and how people can benefit from it on both sides. Flexibility is really important, I think. And I think the lack of flexibility has been a problem for employers in the past.
I think from my point of view, thinking back to sort of the stresses going through part 2 in the standard route, I think the idea of having a job continuously and not having to worry about coming out at the end of part 2 and having to send off 100 applications and getting rejected constantly, and the sort of the stress of and the uncertainty of that the fact that this route avoids that is definitely one of the major appeals that.
Yes, it is. Yeah, it is. And it's also a reason for the political support that apprenticeships have, because apprenticeships are intended by everybody at every stage along the way to broaden the diversity of admissions to universities. You don't have to have any money, right? You'll be good at what you're doing, or good enough at what you're doing for your employer to want to keep you on, right? That you do have to be. But what you don't have to have is you don't have to work your miserable way through the student finances of 2 years of full-time study. It doesn't happen. So it should be, for some people, it should be really noticeably empowering, I think, and it's a way in which universities can demonstrate their diversity of admission as well in a way that benefits absolutely everybody. It's very good, I think, from that point of view.
And then one of the other criticisms of potential criticisms of this route is people say about part 2 that it's about exploration and about testing your ideas out and taking the extreme and finding out what you're interested in, and that's why you end up with all these highly conceptual projects, building space stations and changing the world and all this kind of thing, and all the sort of intellectual learning and sort of, I guess, philosophical learning that goes along with that. Is the criticism that potentially this route might not allow that a valid one, do you think? And if not, why not?
I think that in the fortnight of intensive work, the work is inevitably going to have a high level of experimentation and conceptual experimentation in it, because no one is saying to you in a part 2 course of any kind, here's a list of drawings you must have. You've got to have this elevation at 1 to 50. This is not going to happen. In a fortnight, what you do is really open to the group to some extent. But what you do under the apprenticeship system, certainly under the way in which we operate it, is that having thrown your concepts up into the air and discussed them with the other members of your group and discussed them with your tutors and tried experimentation during that fortnight, you then have more days of your own time in which to turn that conceptual idea into a real one. Now, the idea of reality is something which maybe we will touch on when we talk about Edwardian houses, because what reality means is things being what they actually are, right? I mean, basically, realism, the concept of realism, which is an English idea, early 19th century English idea. Realism is things are what they look like. That's basically it. And you can tell by looking at it what it actually is. Now, the Cambridge School puts, it's a big enough school to have a lot of different types of work going on. So I'm not talking for the whole department. But if I'm talking for a moment about the apprenticeship or the aspects of the Cambridge School which the apprenticeship likes, it likes the sense of the real building. It likes the physical nature of construction. It's a kind of Cambridge thing, I suppose, but of course it's cropped up all over the place, that the value of the building lies in the physical nature of it, the way in which you make junctions between unfamiliar materials, the way in which you experiment with materials to arrive at different events, the physical nature of the building, as a Victorian would say, the reality of the building is a very important thing for us. Now, if you've gone through a process of trying out ideas with your group, arguing in the positive sense through your ideas with your group, arriving at a presentation after a fortnight, it's inevitably going to be up in the air a bit. So then you can bring it down to the physical level in what happens afterwards. But having said all that, I've just told you that the most recent module was one in which our apprentices designed a floating timber structure, and the nature of the material and the exploration of different types of material was actually a very central part of that module anyway.
Mm. And you mentioned it's done in groups. A lot of people have sort of different relationships or difficult relationships with group work, and sort of classic architectural education is very much an individualistic thing.
Yeah.
Mostly, isn't it? You have especially at part 2, where you've got your thesis project or your main project. How do you avoid, in the apprenticeship when you're working in groups, how do you avoid free riders or freeloaders who are not doing any work, or how do you make sure that everyone's contributing and that it's assessed fairly when it's based in a group model rather than an individual model?
This is how we do it. I mean, first of all, we do have an individual thesis project. Okay. So that bit is the same. So you come out of the part 2 education with your own thesis project that you've worked on together with your academic advisor, your supervisor, all the way through. So that is the same. How do we deal with it? Well, first of all, the group working, the team working, is taught formally. Dr. Tim Foreman of the Institute of Continuing Education was the team working tutor for our current apprentices, and he took them through the process of how to work with people, how to notice what the problems are with other people, how to deal with people who aren't doing something, or people who are doing too much, or people being domineering, or all those possibilities. Now, that comes across as theory, right, first of all. But by putting students into smallish groups, 4 or 5 maybe, over the subsequent 4 modules or so, everyone has a chance to try this out for themselves. One of the things that we've suggested to apprentices when they're adding their own work afterwards, when they're completing their design projects, is now do the thing that you weren't doing. During the fortnight, you might have been the detailing person, you might have been primarily, everyone is doing a bit of everything, right? But you might have been primarily the person who sat down and did the construction detailing. You might have been primarily the person who was researching the environmental data. Now, do something else. This we can do with the individual supervisions. We can say to every individual, here is your feedback, here are the comments, what did you do in this group, what did you not do, and then you can address it like that. So that's how you balance it out. I mean, we find that because our apprentices are working in practice the rest of the time, and they've actually all been enormously supportive to each other, where one person has a skill and one doesn't, or one is at a lower stage of development of it. And those skills could be anything, couldn't they? They could be from, can you work on rhino and grasshopper at one end, or it could be, do you know how to do the calculations on the other? So you could be located at any point in that. And we're finding that even under Zoom conditions, that the apprentices have been very good at sharing their skills. And that, I think, comes partly out of the fact that they have to do it anyway. If they're working in a practice, they're a member of a design team. No one in a design team in a professional practice is working on their own, are they? We all know that. I mean, it's always been one of the big gaps in part 2 that no one was trained how to do it. So it is a central part of the whole thing, and it does have different aspects. And the way we deal with the problem that you mentioned is by then taking the time afterwards to say, what did you do, what did you not do? And everyone is learning an enormous amount about how to work with other people, informally as much as formally.
Yeah, have you had feedback from the practices about any differences between the students they have who come from a conventional route versus the ones that are, I suppose, just finishing now the first year? I think
we're too new for that, because we've only been going 3/4 of a year, roughly speaking. So that hasn't happened, though I'm sure it will, because the more we engage practices, the more they'll tell us what they think. We can say that 3 practices who have sent us apprentices in this first year have proposed apprentices for the second year, so they must be happy with what's going on, and that was great news for us that's happening, and I hope that happens again. There have also been cases where we've heard, not actually from the practices necessarily, but sometimes from the apprentices themselves, that the work that they've been trained to do in the course of the intensive modules can actually be put into practice where they are. So, for example, in the case of one practice, took on a job working on a historic building and required some expertise in finding the appropriate information in order to prepare their plan for that project. And because they had an apprentice who'd recently picked up all that training, she was able to do it, right? So that was straight away something that was helpful. And I think there'll be more and more of that. People can take back practical skills that they're picking up from this intensive environment and from a high level of academic expectation, can take it back into the office and can do something useful with it. I mean, here's a boring example of it, Bruce, and that is simply time management. And time management becomes quite complicated. It's not impossible, and everybody, it seems to me, is managing it, even at a time of enormous pressure at work. But we're certainly adding another level of complication. The modules at the beginning of this year took place at the time when everyone was feeling down a bit from the news nationally. And everybody who was part of that beginning of the year all felt it in different ways. And so it was really quite a stressful time, I think, for everybody. And although everything that we do is new in Part 2 education, we are going to get some unexpected side effects, especially from the situation that we're in. But on the other hand, that group pulled through to produce extremely impressive work after only a fortnight, which is fantastic. So I think it's working. I'm always reluctant to say that it's experimental, because experimental makes it sound like it's risky, doesn't it? Mm. But risky is not what it is, because this course has got 6 regulators now that Ofsted has become a university apprenticeship regulator. 6. Include the ARB and the RIBA and the university and everybody else. So a lot of people are keeping their eye on exactly what happens. So therefore, experimental is not quite the right word in that sense. But where but we're going through this stuff for the first time. We didn't necessarily know what is going to happen. We did know that we were going to get some fantastic work out of it, and we did. So, but because everything about it is new, to some extent, it's also the case. What is it that the apprentices themselves want to make out of it? Now, they've got quite a voice in what they want to do. Our apprentices, as I mentioned to you, are forming part of the department's exhibition at the end of the year. How they do it, where they do it, that's up to them.
Mm. It would definitely be interesting to measure, or in some way, or try and get feedback on how employers see the candidates from the apprenticeships differ from the conventional.
Yes, it will. Yeah,
and whether they sort of actually notice that there's a difference in skill level, or ability to manage time, or just general applicability of skills to the office and that kind of thing. Yeah,
I mean, we have to be on our toes. We are charging employers for our services. The employers are also paying, of course, don't forget, for the apprentices' time that's out of the office. So we have got to show all the way along the line that it's worth it. And we've got to show all the way along the line that we are listening and we are responding. So that to that extent, that in a way, that you could almost say that that's part of the excitement, isn't it? We don't know. Our view when we introduced this was that we will take talented people and give them interesting things to do. And then we see what happens, right? I mean, that's the way it should be, isn't it? Rather than thinking of it from a purely bureaucratic point of view. So we don't know what the long-term effects of apprenticeships will be, but we are noticing. Here's an example, actually, of people who are already in a position to make that kind of judgment, Bruce. Some of our apprentices come from large multidisciplinary practices. The multidisciplinary practices have a large number of surveyors, engineers, in them. They have already used the apprenticeship route at different levels within their own companies. They're already used to they already understand the idea and they're used to dealing with it. I would think that those practices are now building up quite a strong bank of knowledge about what is worthwhile for them.
Mm-hmm. And given part of the sort of appeal of apprenticeships is tying in more of the practice-related stuff into postgraduate education, effectively, do you see a way where Part 3 might be tied in closer in some way, or become part of an extended, longer-term apprenticeship in some way or another? Or is that
I think that, well, to some extent, I think what will happen is probably that the ARB and the RIBA, in time, and maybe not that much time, they will react to the changing realities of the situation. Let me give one example. It just suddenly occurred to me, we were talking about professional qualification, about part 3. Talk about the recent Act of Parliament about building safety, right? Now, it's obvious to everybody who read those reviews and who worked their way through what the government was proposing in the way of legislation and what the reviews said and all the rest of it, that it isn't enough just to examine potential architects at part 3 stage on that. It's got to be running all the way through. You've got to understand some of that, the concepts about not only about building safety, but also about who is responsible for what. There is no reason whatsoever why that shouldn't be introduced all the way through the part 2 trading. It's part of collaborative working, for one thing. It's part of awareness of what an architect is, for another. In our part 2, we include the greater part of the part 3 management practice and law training as part of the part 2 training, so that every apprentice can put it into action where they're working and in their design and everywhere else. So you have to show awareness of some of these things which the architectural profession has taken a long time to formalize. You have to show awareness of it in your project work. No, I could go back to the Victorians again, Bruce, and say, what made the Gothic revival happen? One of the things that made the Gothic revival happen was the Gothic revival people could do kitchens and bathrooms, and the classical people couldn't do either of those things. That's
so when you're designing your spaceport or Mars space station or I don't know, rewilding London or something in your postgrad project, you've also got to make sure it conforms to building regulations.
Yeah, but it's also got to be part of your. It's got to be part of your thinking. So the problem that the classical architects had in the 1840s and 50s was that they were trying to put the kitchens and the sort of insofar as they had bathrooms, the water closets, let's say, they were trying to stuff them in the building afterwards, right? The thing about the Goths was that the whole basis of their understanding of what buildings were was that it responded to the things that architects definitely need to do. Architects definitely needed to be capable of designing kitchens and water closets and all the rest of it in the 1830s. And if you didn't have a way of designing that did that, then your career was going to be threatened, right? And it's the same now. You can't add on the environmental parts of this we're all much more familiar with, but to take building safety again, because it's a recent point, you've got to be aware of it right from the start. It's got to be part of your basic way of designing at the outset, rather than as a thing that you learn later on. So those are all, and there are also reasons why learning about some of those things shouldn't be boring, really, I don't think.
Well, the obvious criticism is, by doing that, you're limiting their creative freedom, and they're going to spend all their time thinking about how to do things practically rather than explore.
I don't think that's true, though. Yeah.
I don't know.
But no one is going to say that the Gothic revival in England was boring because it was dealing with practical problems that nobody else had managed to solve. It actually produced amazing buildings because of their attitude to things that they had to do. So I'm not worried by that. I'm actually amazed. One of the things that happens to anybody running a course is you become aware of the 100,000 things that everybody needs to do and be aware of. It's an enormous amount of information. It's really impressive, I think, to see apprentices get to grasp the huge range of stuff. Now, some of those points, which are kind of on the what you might call on the technical side, they're really only part of an enormous story. It's also worth saying that some of the material innovation that our apprentices have been working on with specialists in the field, they were taught over the last month by Dr. Darshil Shah and by Dr. Antiope Koronaki from the Department of Architecture. This stuff, it may be technical, it may require calculations, right? It may be all those things. There's nothing whatsoever that's dull about it. It's enormously exciting and creative. And to be able to spend a couple of weeks together playing with it, seeing what happens, learning what the theoretical and the practical basis is actually really exciting. And then anyway, it's over in a fortnight, right? So if you wanted to do something else afterwards, then you do something to augment your project, then you do that.
Yeah, well, I think it's a really exciting route, and I'm kind of annoyed that it's only just coming in now.
So am I.
I didn't have a chance to do it myself. Okay, we'll sum up then, if you can, in one or two sentences, why people should do an apprenticeship route rather than a standard route and why Cambridge is the best place to do that.
Because it's enormously enriching to your working environment. You are learning, and you're taking it straight back into the office, and you're doing everything at once. You are faced with quite significant conceptual, intellectual challenges because of the way in which we concentrate the work into these fortnights. You have, on the other hand, a realistic way of adding to your own projects afterwards. So it's not stressful all the way through, even though the expectations and the productivity are very high. It should not be a stressful way of doing it. You're being paid to do it. I mean, let's face it, that is quite a big reason why anybody would choose to do it. And you're also making something new. You are changing the face of architectural education really dramatically, I think. So it's now that it'll be up to you as a post-part one to be able to have some impact and some influence on what happens to the architectural profession generally and to architectural education in particular.
Great. Well, I think that's a pretty good overview of the apprenticeship route. We'll take a break there, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about the Edwardians and your new book.
Good, lovely.
Right, so the main reason why we're here is to talk about your new book, which is called The Edwardians and Their Houses, The New Life of Old England, which is a beautiful photo, available at all good retailers. Before we get into the substance of the book, I want to ask you about publishing generally. And as someone who's written an architectural book, and more than one architectural book, you probably know a decent amount about this. Why? It's a particular bugbear of mine that architecture books are extremely expensive. Yours is RRP £45, but I think you can get it on Amazon for about £35 at the moment. Why are architecture books so expensive, and could they be less expensive to make them more accessible to poor, impoverished students?
Yes, this is the central question, isn't it, Bruce? Why are they so expensive? Because not enough people buy them. That's the answer. To some extent, let me say first of all that architectural history publication in Britain is of a fantastically high quality, which I don't know that it exists quite like that in any other country that I've come across. You'd have thought that it might be the case in, I don't know, the United States. It isn't. British architectural publishing is very varied and very high quality. There are a few individuals who've been responsible for that in quite different ways. One of the holes, I suppose, that we've dug for ourselves, anyone who's been involved in architectural publishing, is that standards of production have gone up more and more from year to year. So now, if you got a book and it had a collection of black and white photographs in the middle, you'd be quite disappointed. Nowadays, if you want to produce a high quality book, you don't have any alternative but to get a professional photographer to produce extremely good quality photographs.
Beautifully produced photographs.
Yeah, the photographer was called Robin Forster, and he was fantastic. He was so good, and he was so nice, and he was so good at persuading people to move their junk out of the way of the camera. In every way, he was ideal. And he's now photographing, I'm glad to say, for the Buildings of England, for the Pevsner series, for Surrey, for their new volume on Surrey. But the fact is that if you have good quality paper, good quality photographs, you're paying a photographer to do them, and all that stuff, it is enormously expensive. Unless an architectural history book is aimed at the wider public, and there are about 5 names that can sell a book, and they are, I don't know, Frank Lloyd Wright, Zaha, I should think, possibly Norman Foster, maybe a couple of others. That's it. If you're not a worldwide famous name, then you aren't going to be able to sell enough copies in order to pay for the production. But the system, to some extent, is set up to bring the price down a bit, Bruce. There are, first of all, there are charities. The Paul Mellon Centre for British Art generously supported this book. The Mark Fitch Fund is a fund that specifically supports books on English, I think, or certainly British architectural history. So there are charities that will support it. When somebody who writes an architectural history book works for a university, they can sometimes bring the price down by getting subsidy from their own university, which gets that money back in different ways. But they are expensive, and we are aware of it. But what you're getting generally is enormously high quality. Let me just mention two people who've made an enormous contribution to the quality of British architectural publishing in recent years, and they are Alan Powers and Elaine Harwood of Historic England, who have been responsible over the last 10 years or more, actually. I think actually quite a lot more. The 10 years, certainly, that I was involved with it, with the production of journals and books for the 20th Century Society. The amenity societies maintain very high standards in editing, in production, in images, and the rest of it. And I've seen both Alan and Elaine fight publishers for better quality design, better quality production, and so on. And they win because they're tenacious. And that's made an enormous difference. So that's one reason. The second reason is one which is, I would like to think, if I'm not deluding myself, is connected in a way to books like that Edwardian Houses one. And that is that we have got some fantastic writers of architectural history who know how to tell a story and to make it interesting. The central name is the great Mark Girouard, whose book, The Victorian Country House, Life in the English Country House. These books may be familiar. One of the best, the most impressive things that Mark ever wrote was the chapter in a BBC book based on a series called Spirit of the Age, where he writes over 30 pages with lots of pictures about Victorian architecture. He wrote this in the mid-70s, and no one has ever bettered it. If you want a really beautiful overview of that period, just interestingly, sympathetically written, then that's the book to go to. And Mark Girouard is a central figure in this. But of the next generation, I would mention Andrew Saint, who was my own PhD supervisor, and Clive Aslett, who can tell wonderful, interesting stories about buildings. And this, I think, is partly what marks out English, British architectural history from what you see in many countries where something is either written by a generalist or by an academic, because these are neither of those things, really. These are people who know an enormous amount, take all their research enormously seriously, and at the same time, primarily, they're there in order to tell a story. And that's really significant. My interest in Edwardian architecture originally came about through the Service family. Alistair Service wrote a couple of books on Edwardian architecture, which are very well known. One is the Small Thames and Hudson book, which is simply called Edwardian Architecture. And as an overview, it came out in the mid-70s, and as an overview, it hasn't yet been superseded, really. And he wrote a big book called Edwardian Architecture and Its Origins. It's published by the Architectural Press, the publishers of the Architectural Review. And I bought these as a teenager, and I just was entranced by them. And I knew that was part of the thing that I wanted to be part of as well. You know, that's what I wanted to pick up and continue. Alistair Service was a very perceptive writer. So it's the case with all the people whom I've mentioned, I say this of the previous generation, so of Alistair and of Mark Girouard, that, of course, they didn't necessarily have access to the kind of research information that we have now. We can find out more, as it were, but nothing that they said ever went out of date because they were perceptive about buildings. They knew what the interesting things were about buildings and why somebody would want to pick up those stories and to follow them.
Mm. Yeah, I think your book is well worth the cost, which is not actually that high, to be honest, compared to some architecture books.
No.
I take your point. I think if you're not writing something for a general audience, there's no sense in making it sort of a mass-produced book. And like you say, you couldn't get across the message without really great quality photographs.
No, you can't. And I should say, I don't think there's anyone left in the world who's naive enough to think that books published by monographs about their own work published by British architects, you might say, well, that only costs £20, so why can't we do it with a history book? The answer is that architectural practice is subsidising it like mad. That's why they're paying for it.
Tool, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a publishing tool for them. That's quite right. So that's why they might be more of a reasonable cost, I suppose. The number of people who buy these books is absolutely, I'm afraid to say, very small. So that's what it is.
Wouldn't necessarily increase that massively if you did make it a sort of popular small paperback or something with inserted print.
No, it's got to be a nice thing. I think it needs to be a nice thing, doesn't it?
I think that's something like The Death and Life of Great American Cities, which is a very small paperback. What I have is anyway, with some inserts.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
And it only costs £8 or whatever it is, but you don't get...
It's doing a different job though, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, the reason why photography, why images are expensive is because the Rolls-Royce solution, the best possible solution, is to commission a particular photographer whose style that you like to do the whole lot, because then that set of photographs becomes something in its own right. It might have been possible to have found decent pictures of, say, some, although not all, because some of those buildings are very unfamiliar, but it might have been possible to buy them in or to get them in more cheaply. But if you have a single photographer, then you've got a whole extra element to the book. I mean, nobody's surprised by the idea of somebody who buys books on photography buying a book by a particular photographer, because it's that photographer's work that they're interested in. And the same thing can certainly be true of architectural history, that they're not only recording the building, and they're not only emphasizing the aspects of a building that the writer wants to be recorded. Not only that, but they're also adding a different element of their own. The thing has value as a complete set in its own right, and that's expensive. There isn't any doubt about it. So it should be. Photographers should be paid properly, and that's why books are expensive.
Yeah. Well, I think the quality of the photography in this is absolutely excellent. So kudos to your photographer for that.
Yeah, to Robin. Yeah.
So on the actual substance and the subject of the book, why did you choose this particular subject, and what are the aims of the book when you set out on writing it?
I never know when I write something what it's going to be about until I'm 3/4 of the way through. And then I do. I once heard one of the most valuable lessons about writing I ever heard came from, of all people, Agatha Christie, the queen of crime. Isn't that right? Well, I read somewhere that she told somebody who asked, "How is it that your books, Miss Christie, are better than anybody else's? How is it that we never know who the murderer is, and why no one is as good as you are at doing it?" And she said that what she did was that she wrote the first half of the book without knowing herself who the murderer was going to be. And then she chose the least likely person, and then she continued writing the book and had to tweak the earlier bits to make sure people were in the right rooms at the right time and that kind of thing. That's what she did. Well, that was a clear way of putting something that I kind of vaguely was aware of, which is that you need to be halfway through it before you know what's going on. Now, why did I start in that case? Well, it brings together two major interests. One, as you probably gathered, is realism and the early Gothic revival. Big change in English architecture when it goes from being about drawings of buildings to being about the actual physical nature of the thing. So this is the first thing, which is what Pugin was doing. And addressing a big crisis in the architectural profession at the time, because buildings were going up that were cheap and nasty and falling down, basically. And the Gothic Revival addresses that by giving its primacy to the realism, the reality of the building. That's the first thing. And the second thing, as I mentioned, was my enormous interest in Alistair Service's writing. Now, the story of the British arts and crafts movement is pretty well known, and there are already extremely good books on different architects of the arts and crafts. There's a book, for example, by Sheila Webb by Sheila Kirk on Philip Webb. There's a book by Wendy Hitchwell on CFA Voisey. There's a whole set of books by very good writers about these wonderful designers. So that's out there, and I'm not going to compete with that. And anyone who's interested in them will already know them. Now, what I was much more interested in is what is happening in general in Edwardian England. What are we measuring those great achievements of the arts and crafts designers? What are we measuring it against? What else is happening? And what I discovered was that the great mass of building in the Edwardian period is really the descendant of the early Gothic revival interest in the physical nature of buildings and building materials, of junctions and joints. What happens when you put, for example, a Baroque fireplace inside a Tudor room? Okay, what then? How do you resolve the fact that the things don't really meet up? The bits of the wall don't come in the right place when you get to the window.
Modern kitchen.
Modern kitchen. Yes. Yeah. Right. Yes, that's it. Yes, exactly. And people take the easy way out, don't they, by painting everything white, and then you don't really notice the details anymore. But what Edwardian architects were interested in was they're interested in what happens when you put this next to that. And as a result, you get houses which are fabulously rich and sophisticated in what they're doing. Sometimes, as I was saying a moment ago, sometimes they're mixing styles. So, I mean, admirers of Edwin Lutyens, for example, will know that he sometimes put classical interiors of his own idiosyncratic kind, but classical interiors inside a house which is otherwise Tudor, and that is sometimes thought of as being one of his original contributions. It's not the case. Everybody was doing it. Everyone was mixing up one thing with another thing. So a lot of that is going on. The key figure there is Voys's own mentor, George Devey, who built buildings which sometimes lose their kind of general form because they seem maybe a bit over chaotic. But what they are is very, very precise in the position of the individual building material. Your eye is drawn to this or that specific detail which is doing something. So that is happening. That material thing is happening. The other thing that's happening is the thing that happens in Britain every 50 years, whether architects like it or not, and they always say they don't, and that is a Tudor revival is going on, right? Okay, it comes back all the time. Oh, yes. Cringe. Now, there is an enormous wall of denial going on about this. But in fact, huge numbers of Tudor buildings are built all the time. It's true that for about 5 minutes, somewhere between the late 1960s and the mid-1970s, it looked as if it wasn't going to come back, but then it did. Where I am at the moment, there's a pair of really fantastic Tudor houses that were built about 20 years ago just down the street. It's just a thing.
Does having bolt-on timber plates on the outside painted black?
Yeah, you see, this is where you're falling into the modernist trap, right? The modernist trap is that if it's not doing something structural, then it's fake. Fake's very... Yeah, modernists, the early Gothic revivalists who are like young men with mad staring eyes, and the modernists, they're basically the same lot. Number one, don't have fun, young man, right? This is what they're saying. It's terribly serious, and you're not allowed to enjoy anything. And the thing that you really can't enjoy is being like in a nice, warm, comfortable room that's in a style you like. This is utterly wicked. This was the opinion, as we all know, of hardcore modernists. It was certainly what I was taught when I was a student between 79 and 85. What we were told that being in a nice, comfortable, pleasant room was in some way the work of the devil, because what you should actually have is a room made of breeze blocks with like surface wiring. Some things made out of plywood. I don't know. Right, now the Tudor revival just comes back in different forms because probably some of those early buildings were really quite fabulous is one reason. But it comes back for other reasons in the Edwardian period, which I think are also political reasons. The big fault line between the liberals and the conservatives at the beginning of the 20th century is what it always was and goes on being to this day, which is to do with land control. By and large, cut a very long story short, but by and large, as a matter of principle, the conservatives were there in the interests of the land owners, and the liberals saw themselves as being there in the interest of the people who lived on the land. That was the basic dichotomy in English politics. It appears to have been always the case. It's still the case to some extent now. Go and look, for example, and you're unlikely to do this, I know, but if you felt like it, go and look at the most recent Lib Dem manifesto and see what it says about land control. Not that different from what the Asquith government was saying in 1906.
Which made a distinction when you say liberal.
Yeah.
That would have been the Whig Party back then.
Yeah, it had been the Whig Party. It was reformed as the Liberal Party, the party of Gladstone.
Same as what is now the Labour Party, because that came.
No, it's not the same. No, I mean,
socialism rather than the liberals who eventually lived there.
That's right. If you look at the big central divide, which in England is about land, I mean, think the House of Lords in England, Britain, how did it last so long? Because the purpose of the House of Lords was that it was the landowners. That was the point of it, was that they owned the land. So land ownership's big central arguments for land nationalisation, land reform, all the way compulsory purchase, all these things dominate the politics 1880s, 1890s, 1900s. So that's the first thing, is that. Now, Tudor architecture can do something that classical architecture, Gothic revival architecture, can't do. And that is, it looks like it's come out of the land, right? If you see a Tudor building. Timber frame, all the rest of it. It looks like you could have done it yourself, right? If you were good at it. Nobody is going to say this about a Baroque mansion. Nobody would ever think that the person living in the Baroque mansion had built it themselves. We know that this is an idea which gets revived from time to time. For example, in the case of kit part houses, or even to go kind of upmarket, as it were, to go to Walter Siegel, right? Walter Siegel's houses, where you built it yourself. They're Tudor houses, is what they are. They're modular timber houses. There was a dream of the land reformers in the 19th century that was called 3 acres and a cow, right? This is the birthright of every Englishman. And if you had your 3 acres and your cow, you could do a bit of cutting down trees and digging up the earth, and you could build yourself a Tudor house. So a Tudor house had, for the Edwardians, this sense of belonging to the land, really. The Prime Minister's wife, was a fairly eccentric person called Margot Asquith, and she did something revolutionary which sums this up. Because she was an upper class lady, she said nothing to anybody about any of this, but she did it. Now, what she did was she commissioned an architect called Walter Cave to build herself and her husband, the Prime Minister, a house in the then Berkshire village of Sutton Courtenay, which was constructed in a kind of Stuart style. And in the garden, there was an old medieval Tudor, probably more likely, a barn of some kind. And she converted this into a house by doing very little to it. Walter Cave presumably worked on it as well. Whose idea it was, we don't know. What they did was they cleaned it out, they tidied it up, they restored the old Tudor structure, and she put in it, 4 or 5 bits of good taste furniture that she'd bought in Heels. That's what she did. Now, that is, I reckon, the first barn conversion in England in the modern sense. Good taste, house, minimal done to it, right? She was the first one to do it, as far as I can see. There was a lot of interest in the Edwardian period of converting agricultural buildings into usable rooms. There's a house by the architect Caro, that does exactly that.
Much earlier than that, in the early medieval period, the barns were part of the houses, weren't they? They were like those agricultural areas.
Yeah, it depends what kind of barn they were.
Yeah. Sort of going back to reconverting what was half barn, half house into full house from full barn.
Yeah, there's all that's going on. But the Edwardians are doing this quite a bit, and actually the building regulations change to allow people to convert agricultural buildings into residential ones. Some very imaginative work is done on, and some of these are very attractive buildings. And what they were doing, now here is a big jump from probably what we understand a bit about working with old buildings. What they were doing, and Caro Van, which I mentioned a moment ago, was the king of this. What they were doing was they were collecting bits of buildings, magpie-like, right? And they were installing them into their own old houses. They were not bothered by the modern idea, say that carefully, capital M maybe, the modern idea or the idea of the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings, that old stuff had to be completely perfect, had to be pure, right? You couldn't fiddle around with the old stuff. If, like Margot Asquith, you were going to turn your barn into a house, you had to make it clear what was old and what was new. Now, that's become accepted right across the board. If you go to, for example, the Victorian Society, one of the national amenity societies, with a proposal for changing your Victorian house, they will want you to make it absolutely clear what is old and what is new. Now, the Edwardians didn't have that because the Edwardian architects were much more interested in the physical nature of the bits of the building than they were in how old they are, right? They were remarkably not interested in how old they are. What they're interested in is what is the quality of it. There's a very nice story which is told by one of the Country Life writers. Now, this might be surprising, but Country Life is by far and away the most sophisticated architectural magazine on the design and of old houses in this period.
Say for people who don't know what Country Life is, it's a magazine that talks about, unsurprisingly, life in the countryside.
Yeah, I mean, Country Life
has little to do with buildings.
Well, that's not entirely true, because Country Life has always had, it has an excellent architectural historian as its architectural editor, John Goodall. So it has always had first-rate architectural history in it. But what is probably surprising is that actually they were the first people to do this, to do proper research on the history of houses. It was Country Life. It certainly wasn't, for example, the Architectural Review, and it certainly wasn't the Architect's Journal, the Builder's Journal, its predecessor. They weren't doing it because, like all magazines, they were dependent on what the architects sent in. So if a person you might call a middle division architect like Percy Morley Horder sends in 25 beautiful drawings of their not particularly interesting houses, then the AJ is going to publish it because they haven't got anything else that week. Now, Country Life is not aimed at architects, it's aimed at architects' clients, is what it's aimed at. And what the writers did, Tipping and H. Avery Tipping and later on Lawrence Weaver, is that they're explaining essentially to landowners and to people who want to build houses what a good house consists of. Now, Tipping was a very perceptive writer. He was really in a league of his own. I think he's writing mostly between about 1900 and 1910 for Country Life. He wrote a lot, actually. He wrote about gardens and other things as well. Tipping is describing a house in Broadway in the Cotswolds that's being restored by the architect Charles Mallows. And what he says is that in this house, there was a decrepit old staircase of which some bits were left, and some of the banisters were around, some of the spindles and parts of the balustrade were around. And in Tipping's word, what Mallows did was he regenerated the staircase. It's almost as if Mallows had found the DNA of that particular staircase and he'd made more of it, which involved in it, fixing the old bits to the new bits to make a new one. They were not bothered by whether something was old or not. They were bothered by how good it was. Now, if you are a genius architect, it's Voisey, for example, let's say, recently, famous again from designing the backdrop to the film The Dig. I saw that same Voisey house, Norney Grange, on Midsummer Murders the other day. Bruce, it appears all the time. It's in a film called Carrington, if you want a bit of lush Bloomsbury kind of carry on. What Voisey is doing is something really brilliant, I think. Voisey, let me say, if you want to think remind for a minute who Voisey is, he's the person between about 1900 and about 1914 who's designing houses that are rendered in white, very few details on the outside. We're going to get back to your fake planks in a minute, right? I haven't forgotten the fake planks. And what Voisey is doing, essentially, Voisey trained by Devey, extremely aware of the individual value of little elements. And what Voisey brilliantly does is he takes building elements which are related to the Tudor thing, right, which carries with it these connotations of comfort and warmth and domesticity and all this kind of thing. He's taking these elements and he's spreading them on a white canvas so that you notice. Absolutely, attention is drawn to tiny details of things. And he does straightforward Tudor things like little grotesque faces. Now, let's cut out of brackets. Now, let's go back to the plank stuck on, right? Modernists very keen on this argument, very much against getting a half an inch of plank and nailing it onto the front of your house and painting it black, and as if your house was built of a timber frame, okay? That's why they're against it. In fact, you've nailed your cheap plank onto some concrete blocks, and they think that this is very wicked, right? We heard this many times over in my youth. You couldn't move for hearing it. Now, but that is not what was going on with these houses. A Tudor architect who is fixing those planks, Bruce, onto the front of their house, they're using the symbolism of Tudor architecture precisely the same as when somebody builds a classical house and they take, I don't know, the Corinthian, a Corinthian capital or something. They're taking the attributes of that style and they're stylizing them and they are applying them to the house. It's not at all a matter of something being fake because nobody thinks that it's actually real. It's not intended to be a real thing. If you wanted a direct comparison with classical architecture, you might take the guttei. The guttei are the things that look like pegs, aren't they? That hang down from cornices. Okay, and they're made of stone, right? So does anyone go around saying guttei are fake? Nobody says it. So why should anyone go around saying that the planks that look like Tudor houses are fake? Because they're not fake either. They are a way of putting the symbolism onto the house.
Wouldn't modernists offer the same criticism of classical architecture, that a lot of it's superfluous?
But they don't dislike classical architecture in the way they hate Tudor architecture. For anyone who wants to, I think they do. There's a lot of stuff that they've invented about how modernist architecture is really just classical architecture. I mean, you often heard this. They go back to the AR of the 1970s. You see one modernist architect after the next saying, we've taken our inspiration from Georgian terraces. I mean, they haven't, have they? It's a thing that architects get. They think that if they say something, it's going to be true. We've looked at the architecture of this area and we've responded to it. Well, that part of it might be true. But the bit about this 1960s brutalist building looking like a Georgian terrace, it just is not true, is it? I mean, it just isn't. It doesn't look like one in any way. There's some stuff about, because functionalism, careful here in choosing the words, comes from a kind of French neoclassical origin, rationalism, all those things that the French had and the English didn't. They set up a kind of line of descent for modernist architecture. But I would say Tudor architecture is modular, first of all. It seems to me that if you're modular and you're organic, you are in a sense quite, I mean, I hesitate to use the word modern.
Sense that it's made of standard.
Yeah, it's made of standard bits. Yes, that's right. Yeah, exactly. You take something. You take Little Morton Hall, right? The bonkers Tudor house. And the actual bits of it are quite straightforward. It's just been, as it were, screwed together in an unusual way. You could perfectly well say that if something is modular like that and organic like that, that it is a kind of you could, if you want, say that was a predecessor of free organic building 60s and 70s. I mean, nobody does say it, but it doesn't make it not true.
Yeah, it's a weird sort of, I mean, people obviously think of modular in a different way these days because of the sort of the volumetric modularity that you get in sort of prefabricated modern methods of construction houses and buildings. But I don't know where the line lies with it, because you could say, yes, in a green oak frame or whatever it is, you're using sort of standard cut length and that kind of thing. But couldn't you also apply that to the smaller elements that you get in those brick standard houses? Oh
yeah, of course you can. Yeah, absolutely.
And if it's cut timber frame but concealed stick in timber frame. So can you really call one modular and the other one not modular? Is it based on the size?
Well, people don't. I suppose the truth is there's probably not particularly helpful words really when you're talking about Tudor architecture or about Edwardian architecture, but nevertheless the fact is there. It looks like stuff that you assembled. It can look, however sophisticated and expensive it is, and some of those houses are very expensive and very sophisticated. It looks a bit like you assembled it yourself. There's another thing to say, which I think is a really interesting part and always a valid part of Edwardian architectural history, is the amount of effort put by talented architects into designing very, very cheap houses. And the example that I give in the book is the Gidea Park estate in Romford, in southwest Essex, northeast of London, which is an estate which is still in the most fabulous condition. That is what the estate was essentially a set of show houses that cost either £375 or £500. Now, if you convert those into modern money, it comes out to something like £30,000 for a small house and £40,000 for a big house. Well, that isn't evidently exactly right, but they were very cheap houses, and they were almost entirely these Tudor houses. So there's another part of the political message as well, I think, is that you can take your place on the land with one of our houses because you can afford to. You know, this is the stuff that grows out of the ground, or it's made with the bricks and as well as the timber frame, and it's representative of your own ownership of your own tiny piece of land, and you can afford it, and it is realistic. The Liberal government did a lot of land reform between 1906 and 1910. It set up what was essentially the first real town planning act in 1910, because the British political system had been devised to protect the landed interests over centuries. So you need an act of parliament, right? If you want to take land away from someone, you need an act of parliament. This comes to an end for the first time, to some extent, in the Housing Town Planning Act passed by the Liberal government at the end of that period. But they're doing other things as well. There's a Small Holdings Act, or two Small Holdings Act, that enable tenants to take control of the piece of land on which they are located. So there's a lot going on, and here style and quality and land ownership and Liberal Party tradition and the imagery of English Tudor architecture, they're all coming together to produce buildings of staggering high quality.
Well, I always thought the Edwardian period is kind of overlooked, isn't it? Because we all know loads about Victorians. There's loads of massive, impressive Victorian public buildings that everyone knows about, and they're very distinctly Victorian. And then you obviously later on in the 20th century move into distinct modernism. and there's this sort of slightly shorter period in between of what is effectively the last song of, I guess, quote unquote traditionalism.
Well, except it doesn't really go away. I remember when the back in the 1980s, the Hayward Gallery in London had an exhibition called the 30s, which I went to with my dad, and I remember my dad saying, "I can't imagine why anyone would want to have an exhibition about the 30s. They were horrible." Well, that was easy to believe. But one of the famous aspects of that exhibition was that it had an architecture section which had in it 10 modernist buildings, High Point probably, and I don't know what else, the Delaware Pavilion. Now, the point about this was that there were only about 10 modernist buildings in Britain, slight exaggeration, but not actually that much of one. There were almost none. Yet everyone has the impression nowadays that Tudor architecture, for example, came to an end in the First World War, and maybe there was a bit of Neo-Georgian, but basically it was modern from 30s onwards. It's completely untrue. There was an architect in this town. I'm in Broadstairs. There was an architect in this town called Edgar Ranger, who in the 1920s was building lush Tudor houses in the kind of Agatha Christie murder mystery style. There's one immediately behind me. He built quite a bit of this. They've got lots of fancy edgings to them, ornamental ladders fixed to the outside as if to get your hayloft and all the rest of it, and your Tudor cocktail cabinet. They were the works, right? They were exactly where the glamorous kind of Tudor interwar style. Now, Edgar Ranger, he then went back to, he went off to Buckinghamshire and built a lot of houses around Gerrard's Cross in the area. In the 1960s, he came back to Broadstairs and he built more Tudor houses. They're cheaper, they're simpler, but they are essentially, if we're going to categorize them as something, then what they are is Tudor for sure. It doesn't go away.
Is Tudor the right word to use, or would it be better to call it vernacular? Because it's sort of a continuation. I know we call it Tudor because it was particularly highlighted that half rendering was particularly a thing in the Tudor period. But it was there before the Tudors, and it continued after the Tudors, and people are still building half-timbered houses all over the place.
Yeah.
With the self-builders and stuff.
Why Tudor?
Surely it's just a general continuation of what is the English vernacular because of the environmental and the fact that it's built of local materials and this kind of thing that fits in its place. It's just a sort of continuation of that.
Yeah.
And the Edwardians just took that and adapted slightly and continued the vernacular, where the modernists decided, no, we don't like that, we're going to do something completely different. And that sort of, like you say, is...
So why is it Tudor rather vernacular? I don't think English seem to have fascination with Tudors. That's probably why. I mean, you could say that Tudor architecture is English vernacular architecture. The most evident manifestation of English vernacular architecture is Tudor architecture, probably.
Actually, no one knows any other periods of time to...
Well, look, I would say...
People don't know what Jacobean is or what Elizabethan is, but Tudor sort of everyone seems to know.
Yeah, I did once. I realised that you could look at modern houses, right? Modern with a small m, recent houses, and you could categorise many of them using historical terminology. So, for example, some of these are obvious and some of them are not. So, if we take if you take, for example, Charles Holland's House for Essex, right? Now, I would say that that's a kind of house of the 1830s, essentially, because if you look at what architects are talking about and what journalists are talking about in the 1830s, there's a lot of stuff about rediscovering ancient forms and who are we as a people and a rediscovery of the quality of built work. All that is going on in the 1830s and 1840s. And I would put Charles's house in that category. You could take houses by Proctor and Matthews, whom I mentioned earlier, and say they're a kind of Tudor architecture in a way. I mean, they did build a modular house with a flint infill in steel trays, I think, but a timber frame in Norfolk early in their career. 3144 architects, who are protégés of Proctor and Matthews, build houses which are Victorian in a way, in the way in which they treat the surface of the walls. So people are going back to old ideas. They just aren't admitting it. That's what I'd say. I mean, I would say that that there are more examples of this than you think. I mean, it's a great oddity that you take the Patel Taylor's almshouses in Dagenham, right? That is a Tudor building, isn't it? It just clearly is. It has those enormous chimneys, and the modernists all fell about frothing at the mouth because the chimneys were not actually chimneys, right? So out comes the fake sham, all the rest of it. Oh no, what's happened? But they were something else. They were part of the ventilation devices within the buildings. It could be medieval. It could be Tudor. There are many architects that are actually using all that historical stuff. Once they've escaped from the modernist tendencies of architecture schools where old-fashioned, hardcore, puritanical modernism clung on far longer than it did in any other part of the world, once you've got out of that, you begin to, and you see more buildings comes into it as well, obviously. You think, well, actually, I could do a bit of this here. I don't need to employ historical detailing, but say I did employ historical detailing, does it actually matter? And it doesn't, does it? Why not? You only live once, build the building that you want to do.
Well, what seems to be happening now is that people like, I can't remember which practice it is, but there's sort of a blending into what I call vernacular modernism, or modernist vernacular, where you've got, especially in small-scale house building or low-rise house building, where you've got what is a traditional form with a pitch roof, but it has sort of flush detailing, no window surrounds, plain no windows with no mullions, plain doors with no mullions, and sort of modernist details, but on a effectively vernacular frame, if you like. And there's sort of kind of a middle ground. I sort of watched the government gradually adopt that sort of thing into its, no, actually we can't persuade everyone to build neoclassical sort of Georgian houses everywhere. We need to bring people in more, and bring sort of, I guess, architects in more as well. And that there's therefore a sort of a stronger blend of those two things.
Well, there's more styles going on. It's just that people don't talk about it in those terms, do they? But you could perfectly would. I mean, you could say that Stephen Taylor is building medieval buildings in a sense, or those amazing cottages, Craddock cottages in Surrey that he did, for example. It's like a medieval building, isn't it? People are doing it. They're just not talking about it. It's a shame. I think if they did talk about their buildings more in historical terms, the discussion of them would become more interesting, and also it would be easier for outsiders looking on to see what is happening, because English architecture, English domestic architecture, we're talking about houses mostly here, aren't we? It is really rich. The classicists are more organised than the others, so you do hear a bit more about what they're doing. But actually, everybody's doing it in different ways. They're more literal, maybe, but not always. Actually,
well, you mentioned Country Life earlier. If you scroll through sort of the buildings in Country Life, 10 pages physically through Country Life these days, most of the architecture you see, apart from the houses that are for sale, is basically mansion neoclassicism.
Yes.
Where you get incredibly bad.
You're very influenced by modernist terminology, aren't you?
I just think that's right. I've got to say I agree with them on this.
You agree with them about that?
I mean, not every example. There are some examples of good classicism, not that I'm a particular fan of classicism, but most of it is terrible. And most of it's done for Russian oligarchs and rich people are trying.
Yeah, I mean, I don't mind who's paying. What I want to see is architects getting good jobs with lots of money in. So I personally don't mind who it is that's paying for it. I don't know. I think. I mean, I went not long ago to Henbury, which was the house designed by Julian Bicknell in Cheshire near Macclesfield from the 1980s onwards. It's a tiny, perfect little version of Merryworth Castle, and it is fabulous as an object. And also, by the way, it has in it this mixture of styles, which is unexpected. It has on the inside of it is kind of William Kent. It's very English looking on the inside, and the outside of it is more or less Palladio, and the two things join together very well, I think. I mean, I'm all in favour of enjoying different things from different points of view. It's happening. It's just that people don't talk about it in these historical terms. Just as people don't talk about houses. And I'm thinking, for example, of Ken Shuttleworth's house, the crescent-shaped house that he did. That's in the north of Hampshire, isn't it? Somewhere, I think, or it's somewhere on the Hampshire-Berkshire boundary, somewhere around there. Now, what you could say about that is a building it's a building that's white and glass, right, and curved, and that has the plan of two crescents kind of backing into each other, roughly speaking. Now, you could say that's a historical revival because it's a revival of Bauhaus stuff, is what that is. It's taking this it's doing something different with ideas that are essentially Bauhausy kind of ideas about surfaces and about geometry and so on. So you could say that Ken Shuttleworth's house is also a kind of historical revival. You can see it all over the place. It's not difficult to do it actually especially at the moment. You can look at architects of all kinds And some of the people who are building brick buildings in London, for instance, are now beginning to get a bit more experimental with the decoration, with the brick surfaces, with the rest of it. And they're not doing something. I mean, it looks like a building of 2012, just as an Edwardian building might look like a building of 1905. But they're buildings that plug into long historical history. And they're beginning at last to say it more than they did.
Well, it's almost like a whole generation of architects has to relearn how to do that sort of thing.
Yeah, they have to relearn. And you certainly, up to now, you haven't been taught this in architecture school, have you?
No, not at all.
No, you haven't.
I found a great book. I can't remember. It was something like 1860s or something in a second-hand bookshop. It was effectively a technical book, a bit like the how building construction illustrated book or whatever.
Yeah.
But it's that book, but from the 1860s. And it's got all of the amazing like brick details and shows how to construct them and the kind of thing you just never find anywhere else in like any other architecture.
Well, there's a whole series of different types of books that come out in the 18th century, in the 19th century, 20th century, and all this arises from that period which I alluded to, which was a terrible crisis in architecture when buildings were really badly built by people who didn't designed by people who didn't really know what they were doing, and by which I mean they didn't know how the roof attached to the wall, that kind of thing. So and the response to that, the artistic response to that is the Gothic revival. The intellectual response to that is the Gothic revival. But the response of the building profession as a whole is to raise its constructional standards enormously, which means proper training and proper detailing, which means proper textbooks of the kind that you've seen. And they're still around. I mean, the same publishers are still producing them.
Yeah. Well, do you think, you mentioned people don't talk about architecture in historical terms anymore. Do you think there's a taboo within the industry to do that?
Yeah, there is. Yes.
Why is that there?
Well, because of the overwhelming dominance of modernist language about fake and sham and all this. That's why. Why did it last so long? It's in the realm of psychology, isn't it? It's not to do with reality because the buildings are changing and developing.
Yeah, I've always interestingly noticeable, especially within spheres like the interior design sphere, that sort of bold patterns and complex ornamentation on a sort of surface level, and then in a sort of colourful way, but not in a massing way, definitely has come back and is continuing.
Yeah, that came back. Yeah, and it wasn't allowed, when I was a student. It did come back quite soon after that, but it certainly wasn't. And there's a lot of... there was a kind of politicizing of postmodernism that went on, for instance, which was not really justified by the historical facts that it was sort of a right-wing way of building. That tends to dominate. I mean, just a general rule, when people are talking about buildings in terms which are not building construction terms or building history terms, then they very quickly get onto other things such as politics or fakery or all these other things. And it always seems to me to be like a sign of that the person doesn't really know what they're talking about. And how can you? You saw this. There was an occasion, a very regrettable occasion when here's something for everyone to do, right? There's a little homework for everybody, is that there was an attempt, I think about 5 years ago now, to make some alterations to James Stirling's building in the City of London, which I can't remember the name of, number one something, the one opposite the Mansion House, the one on the corner. That's right. And there was an attempt at turning the essentially altering the arcade on the outside of it and turning it into some more shopping space. Well, go and look what Twitter had to say about this. The whole thing turned into this terrible, disgusting battle from the 1980s about styles and how decorative architecture was just some kind of form of decadence. And it wasn't to do with the truth of building, which was about building brutalist blocks for poor people. I mean, really, it's got nothing to do with it. If I was going to be an Edwardian, or if I was going to be a Puginite early Victorian, I would say it is the thing that matters. How do you judge it? It could be better, it could be worse. But it's not about whether Mrs. Thatcher was Prime Minister or not. That's for sure.
Yeah, well, you're right. Okay, I think one of the encouraging things I've heard recently is the slight revolt against concrete generally, because of its bad environmental effects and the general increase in favourability towards timber products, which is good to hear. And obviously, most of that is glue laminated systems, which are just as sustainable, if not probably more sustainable than cut timber. And that's very encouraging to see that kind of thing is coming back. I mean, maybe with that there'll be more of an interest in the kinds of sort of details and detailing and the architectural things you can do with that as a material, as opposed to sort of the brutalist things within concrete.
Oh yeah, I think that's probably true. There is much more interest in detailing, but there's more interest in detailing because there's a lot of other pressures on architects. We were talking about building safety earlier on. Well, that's clearly one of them, isn't it? But there are other ones too, environmental ones, or any other areas where an architect is responsible for a building. So there is much more intelligent interest in the detailing of things. And that's also what should be, I think, go back to our original subject, quite a major plank of whatever is taught literally, whatever is taught at part 2, because that's where you need to hear about the ideas for it, and that's where you can put it into practice at work straight afterwards. So there's, I'm all in favour of all that stuff about what the actual interface between the building and the person and the builder. These things seem to me to be really the core of what the whole thing is about. And there's nothing boring about them. Endless inventiveness and creativity in dealing with those things.
And to link that back to the Edwardians, the sort of the locality of material sourcing, that kind of thing, even if these days you're not realistically going to be able to source everything locally, the sort of bringing that in a sustainability sense and in a sort of community sense of building that sort of cohesion aesthetically within an area by using the architecture to make somewhere blend in.
Yeah, it's absolutely.
Not just be a passive.
Yeah, and that I think is working. I think people are more aware. By people, I mean probably students, sort of more mature students, are more aware now of the importance of doing that. Actually, I think that has caught on in a broader sense, and so it should.
Well, you mentioned the distinction between creating a distinction between what is new and what is old earlier.
Yeah.
And obviously there's lots of examples of this where you might get a church or a castle with glass doors in timber ones and a modern cafe stuck on the side, and then there's a clear delineation placed. Do you think the attitudes that architects have will ever change to the extent that we go back to what the Edwardians were doing, where they're creating new bits of buildings that you can't tell what was added on where, and it's sort of more of a mishmash kind of?
Well, it'd be difficult, wouldn't it? Because the SPAB, the Study of Protection of Ancient Buildings dogma, is so firmly entrenched everywhere that it'd be very difficult to change it. Glass doors in churches, though, I do know a bit about them because I have been for a long time a member of the casework committee of the Victorian Society, and many of the applications are applications to, in some form or another, wreck churches, basically. And putting in glass doors to replace timber ones are a very interesting example of the problem, because, of course, there is no practical advantage in it whatsoever. It's a political gesture. It's a symbolic gesture. When we say to the vicar of a church, why do you want to take out your beautiful George Gilbert Scott door with its beautiful detailing that works so well and the key still turns and all the rest of it, and replace it with a piece of glass with 2 large steel hinges on it, they will say it's because we want to welcome people in, right? That's what they say. So we say to them, inevitably, but they won't be welcomed in. What will happen is that they will see a reflection of their own face, is what they will see. And then this will be then followed by a speech about how we don't understand how important it is that we welcome people in. So it's a political argument, has nothing to do with the physical nature of the building.
Also kind of wrecks the experience of entering a building.
Yeah, of course it does. No, it's atrocious.
Especially in European churches, where you go in the main door, and there's a little area that's closed in timber, so you have to go through the side door and then round, and that's the moment when you're revealed to the church. Yeah,
some of those things are done really well in churches, ancient and modern, aren't they? It's one of the most interesting things about designing a church is that you can do that.
Yeah, even a local one where it's just a single door, where you sort of have to ease open this ridiculously heavy, stiff door that sort of creaks as you do it, and then you get an amazing glimpse of the interior of the church.
Yeah.
Whereas when you approach a church that's got a glass door, if it's illuminated inside, which probably is, you can already see in and already see down, and you don't get that distinction between see nothing and
Well, there is a long tradition in the Church of England, unfortunately, and by long tradition I mean probably came back to the 16th century most likely, which is that of wanting to wreck the building in order to show that you're not in some way overpowered by it. There is a book, I can't remember the name of the author now, but he was quite a big figure in Church of England, what they call reordering, which is the euphemism for smashing it up. It was called Pitching the Tent, and what it did was it explained to church wardens, explained to parishes how to wreck your church to the greater glory of God, right? This is what it was about. So there is a theological thing going on, which is not much, which has got nothing to do with the quality of the building, and it's the quality of the building arguments, the ones that I'm more interested in.
Although, say we shouldn't really talk that much about churches, because realistically there aren't that many churches that are still operating and
No, there's quite a lot.
Use.
No, churches have too much. I mean, I know from the casework committee that churches either have too much money or too little money. If they have too little money, they're trying to think of other things that they can do in there, which mean dividing up the inside. And if they have too much money, then they are smashing them up just for the sake of it, as far as I can see.
Well, if you let's try applying that to a more common typology of just a house. Obviously, most work that the average architect gets, especially small practices and things, is extensions of some kind. And then obviously you go along training and see 10,000 different extensions.
Yes, absolutely.
Some are wide ones and others are pitch ones and all that. If it was the Edwardians doing that, if you were a client and you went along and you said, I've got my 2-3 story Georgian townhouse and I want to extend it to put a new kitchen and living room on the back, and I want to go out by 4 meters or something, how would an Edwardian of the kind that you write about in your book respond to that architecture?
Well, there aren't that many examples of them doing it, because when they were around, there weren't so many houses to alter, right? So that's the first thing. But I can tell you about one really sensational and little known example by Voisey again. And what I was saying about Voisey was that what is the main feature of his work is very careful positioning of different details. It seems to me to be a lot of what it's about. Now, at some point in the Edwardian period, Voisey was commissioned to remodel a plain, dull, 1860s, I think, Victorian villa in Fitzjohn's Avenue in Hampstead. And he did a lot of changes to the inside, most of which have not survived. But some of his changes burst out through the wall. So there is a bow window where he put a dining room on the ground floor. There is a new porch arrangement. There is down the side a different kind of window. There's another one at the back. So he was fiddling around with a Victorian house. Now, this is really, although it's small and there's not much of it, it's a really sensationally clever thing that is going on, because I was saying about Edwardian architects took a lot of interest in how do you put something very different next to something else. And that's what's going on here. He's putting some characteristic Voisey detailing bursting out of a Victorian frame, and to resolve the detailing between the stone bow window and the plain brick. And it's a very difficult thing to do, very hard thing to do. It's almost as if the house on the inside has been taken over by some kind of parasite, and it's something else growing inside it that's bursting out in the corners. It's a really brilliant piece of work. And although it was fiddled about with in the 1930s, shamefully, by an architect who bought it, thought that he was going to do better than Voisey, and cleaned out all the Voisey stuff and put in something much more ordinary, I think, on the inside. The bits on the outside from the Voisey alteration are just a brilliant example of that. So there isn't much of it, because the people who are living in terraced Victorian houses were not building extensions by 1900. So it wasn't really happening in general. But you can find examples of where it did happen. I mean, here's another example of a piece of spab modernist also dogma, which is that there is something inherently wicked about holding up the front and building something different behind it, right? We hear a lot about this. Spab recently published a book that's going on about this. I can't remember what it's called. Facadism, to use a piece of modernist insight. There's a modernist insight. See, you're just full of them, Bruce. The effect of your architectural education, obviously, it did its job, didn't it? Facadism. I'm one of them. one of the facadism. If you've got a perfectly decent front to the building and you need a different thing behind it, then why shouldn't you do it? It's not that God is watching and he'll be cross with you, which is maybe what some Victorians might have thought, or indeed what modernists thought in their own particular way. You can do what you want as a designer, and if you can do something really clever that's happening, as Voisey does in Hampstead, between the inside and the outside, that seems to me to be a positive thing to be said. Now, there is a very well-known modernist building which does exactly that. And that is the Asplen's Law Courts in Gothenburg. Now, we know about the building on the right-hand side of the main front is a modernist building. It took Asplen a long time to do it, so it changed its style, but it ended up as what we basically call a modernist building on the right. But what is very much a feature of that building is that Asplen continued and rebuilt behind the Baroque facade of the old building, right? So he's doing this thing that's thought to be utterly wicked. And by the most amazing coincidence, nobody's complaining about that, are they? How clever, how interesting. Well, this is what Edwardian architects are doing all over the place. And anyone can do it. Why shouldn't they? There's not a law against it. If there isn't, I know that a university in London, which will remain nameless, got itself a bad name by propping up an old front and then building a new building behind, and the windows didn't coincide. Do you remember that business?
Yeah, I remember that one.
Yeah, it's in Islington somewhere, wasn't it? Well, that's shocking, isn't it? But that's bad design. That's not facadism. That's just an awful thing to do. Is what that is.
It's the case that if you've got a building whose main architectural viewpoint is a piece of road frontage of any given length, and that's it, and you can't really get to the back, and you've got other buildings on both sides, you're always going to get, or probably going to get, a boring internal structure, unless you go for like a courtyard or something. But assuming it's just a standard sort of floor plate kind of building, it's always going to be fairly dull inside if you're doing something standard, and therefore the face that it's showing to the world is always going to be more interesting. And therefore, later down the line, when it has to be renovated in some way, the interesting bits are going to stay, and the boring bits are probably going to get demolished.
Well, yeah. I mean, first of all, yes. I mean, we all know, even the RIBA tells us that the first priority should always be to keep the building that you already have and do something to that. So, yes, you're right. If the bit behind is dull, then it can be remodelled to suit somebody else, and the expensive bit, as it were, can stay the same, and then it seems to me that everybody's profited. It's not always that way around. I can't, the name of the architects I can't quite think of, but there's a pair of houses in Dulwich, isn't there, where they're a pair of semi-detached, where the front elevation to the street is a stone elevation, red stone elevation, and the building behind it is a timber building, of quite a sophisticated kind. So the building behind is different, but it's equally complex. I apologise for not being able to remember what their name is, but it's a very striking thing. I mean, they also come. I mean, that's kind of Victorian building in a way, but maybe that is what you do. Maybe you build long-term facades and you build different things behind it that come and go, so that you don't pull down the whole thing and start all over again. The Edwardians also, by the way, and there's an example in there, designed houses that looked as if they were houses that had been meddled with for 300 years, but in fact were completely new.
There's also a form of impurity.
Oh, yes, sham, the fake, facadism, it's all those things. It's all the things that you're not allowed to do. It is, and they're very beautiful houses. The one in there is a house built by the architect of the Savoy Hotel, the Cambridge Theatre, the theatre on Cambridge Circus in London, Thomas Colcott, and he built a house for himself, and it looked as if it had slowly grown from the 16th, beginning of the 16th to the end of the 17th century. That's what it looks like. That was the period that the period that the Edwardians loved was what happens in the 17th century, because it's so varied. It starts off as Jacobean and it ends up as Baroque, right? So there's lots of things you can do within quite a short time scale. And if you really love those styles, and if you're saying, well, shall I make my house 1620 or shall I make it 1680? Well, I would say, well, how about making it both? Well, just mix them together and have a really lush and enjoyable combination of the two things. The more you play around with the historical elements, the more it will, intelligently, as to say by thinking about it, the more it will turn into something personal. Because of this thing about you mustn't ever do historical styles or you'll go to hell, this thing, because of that, people became very cautious about talking about using historical ideas. unless there was some kind of approved model, in which case they were allowed to.
Well, as you said earlier, what now happens is architects just reference something nearby, and they like say the chimneys on the housing, or they'll do in their design active statement, they'll take a load of pictures of all local buildings, and they'll create a sort of minimalist version of something they've seen locally. Like, what's the one, the Oast houses? It's got the 4 new Oast houses.
Oh, I know the one you mean. Yeah.
With the colourful tiles on the outside.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Which is
that's great. I thought I loved it.
Yeah, I was clearly referencing Kentish Oast houses.
Yes.
It's done
yeah, why not? As I would say, there isn't a law against it. If you enjoy it, then do it. A lot of those vernacular buildings do have unusual shapes, which you could do unusual things with. And it was the Edwardians, by the way, who turned Oast houses into houses. And quite surprising people. Reginald Blumfield, who you might know, I'm sure, as the architect of the bottom bit of the Regent Street quadrant and bits of Piccadilly Circus. That was him. He did up an Oast house in Kent and turned it into a kind of weekend cottage. There's a lot going on, and that also tells you that big architects, as it were, who do big expensive buildings, they were doing it as well. They enjoyed doing those kind of projects, I think.
There's still, I notice what I call a mono-materiality, where architects will start to experiment with things like slightly more brickwork detailing, but then they'll use the same material, the same type of brick, the same timber across the entire building.
They will. That might be money, might it? I mean, that might be a perfectly valid budgetary reason.
Maybe, but I mean, in comparison to the Edwardians, they had effectively a palette of materials, didn't they? They didn't. It was more.
Yeah, they were
a mishmash of complementary materials, where it's like hung files and brick and timber and and timber paneling.
Yeah, and one reason why that happens is because from the 1890s onwards, and also in Country Life, which is founded in 1897, there are books and articles that describe in detail the details of vernacular houses and cottages across England. So you could get hold of it, right? If you were a designer who was interested in that kind of thing, you didn't have to guess it and get it slightly wrong. You could actually go to reliable books, usually published by Batsford, but also in Country Life, and take the real details that you know work. So that had quite an impact. In order to have a revival of any kind, there needs to be a decent set of sources of information. One of the many reasons why the Gothic revival was impossible before the Pugin era was that there was no access to accurate drawings, not only of medieval churches, but of medieval churches as they had been, reconstructions, as it were, reconstruction drawings, because all of the 10,000 or so medieval churches in England were a terrible mess by the time you get to the 1830s. And if you looked at one, it wouldn't tell you that much about what a medieval building looked like. So it's only when the great John Brittain, from the 1820s mostly onwards, is publishing accurate, what he calls scientific illustrations of historical buildings, and also employing Pugin's dad to do reconstructions, right? So if the building is like half fallen down, then Pugin's father would learnt how to reconstruct it as it had been, accurately, fine lines, right? Copper engravings. Then architects anywhere can find the information and can start doing it themselves. So that launches the Gothic revival, and the Tudor revival is launched to some extent by the fact that you could get your hands on accurate information in that period in a way that you were not able to before.
What was the castle that won the Sterling Prize, where they rebuilt a few years ago?
Yeah, I know, yes.
Is it L, I think, I can't remember. But I've always had this idea of, if you've got a castle ruin, do you go along and then do you extend the walls up with glass and go immediately say like old bit?
Well, that's sort of what they do, isn't it?
Yeah,
that is what they did.
Or do you learn how the stonework was done and rebuild the stonework in the way that it would have been, and then maybe change the design?
Well, how about this, Bruno? You can do either or both if you feel like it. If it's going to be good, if you're going to get the detailing right, then what does it matter? You can do that. I mean, one thing the Edwardians did a lot of was they did a lot of rebuilding of castles. There was one just down the road from where we're sitting at Kingsgate. It wasn't a medieval castle. It was a Georgian folly. That was a kind that turned into a ramshackle house that was turned by the great Lord Avebury, the person who brought us bank holidays. It was turned by him into a grand Edwardian house. It was remodeled essentially by the architect called Romain Walker, W.H. Romain Walker, and turned into a new kind of house. The inside of it was different types of classical in most places. The outside of it was an Edwardian version of a Georgian version of a medieval castle. So you've got loads of things going on at once. There is a lot of castle rebuilding in that period.
All right. The last thing I wanted to touch on was about planning reform, briefly. I wanted to quote one of the quotes that you put in your book from Bidlake, which is, "We do not want a new style. We are reverent as a people, and we are not only proud of the heritage which our fathers have left us, but we wish to feel that our dwelling houses trace the lineage also from those of old time, and echo by their similar disposition of stone gable or mullioned window some of the romance that attaches to old buildings." That quote kind of reminded me of what it appears the government is trying to do in its planning reform, of the sort of design guides and created by local people and local councils, and making, I don't know, Kent look like Kent, making Hampshire look like Hampshire.
You mean the design guide stuff?
Yeah,
is what you mean?
Yeah, which appears to be what the government is trying to do in its reforms.
Yeah.
Is enabling local people and local councils to have mechanisms where that is compulsory.
Yes.
In some way or another. What do you think of that as an approach, and what will be the issues, and how does that line up with sort of architectural philosophy of Edwardians and other?
I think it's not. I think it's not. It's not the situation that it is sometimes caricatured to be. I mentioned earlier that the pro-Georgian people are well organized as a lobby, so they knew when to make a lot of noise about it, and there was a kind of public impression that the government was going to force everyone to build Georgian houses, or as Bidlake might want it, Tudor houses, right? That's what it sounds like. I think there is more to it than that. First of all, it depends enormously on the sophistication and the subtlety of the design guides themselves. It can be enormously important documents, and the more architects are involved with them, the better. Secondly, I want to mention, I don't think you'd mind me saying this, there is in the 1980s, when I was doing my part 2 at the Barclay, we had a guest lecturer for a couple of occasions called Nicholas Falk, who went on to found a planning consultancy called Urbed, which is very much still around, and Nick is indeed still involved with it. And everything that Nick said in about 1983 to 5, it must have been, everything he said turned out to be true. So I put considerable weight on what it is that he said. And he came to speak to my apprentices last September, because I'm keen to have cutting-edge people talking. And what Nick said was this. He said that he hadn't gone through the whole thing in enormous detail, but his immediate response was that what the government was proposing was something similar to the planning system in the Netherlands, which has produced very high quality domestic architecture. So it would be a mistake, I think, to write it off at the outset on the basis that it was going to produce lots of Georgian houses. I mean, you mustn't forget, there are a lot of people who would be perfectly happy if it did produce lots of Georgian houses. If somebody wants to live in a Georgian house, then not specially any right of ours to tell them that they shouldn't. But that aside, I don't think it's saying that necessarily. It's going to depend on how carefully and how well the design guides are done. And if I understood Nick correctly, and he's saying this is pretty much what happens in the Netherlands, and it produces really excellent results because the design guides are clever and they are careful, then it can produce high-quality housing just as much as any other system could. I mean, the general simplification of it, I don't see any problem with. And you may remember, whenever it was coalition government, wasn't it? It simplified the planning legislation from 10,000 pages to 50 or whatever it was. And everyone was going around saying the sky is going to fall in and it's terrible and, whatever next. But it didn't happen, did it? It's one of those arguments that went away the next day when Mrs. Thatcher became Prime Minister, the argument about whether a woman could be Prime Minister. No one ever said it again from that moment onwards. When 16-year-olds in Scotland were given the vote at the last referendum, the whole subject just died there and then because it worked. The same thing happened with that particular planning review. So I don't know. There are bound to be unintended consequences, because there always are, aren't there, of any big change. But I don't think it's something that people should write off from the start. And maybe there will be places where the houses will turn out to be all Georgian or Tudor, but it's probably quite unlikely, actually.
Well, the obvious argument from most architects, including myself, I'd say, is that it will inadvertently stifle innovation in architecture of things that would fit in well, but for whatever reason don't conform.
Yeah, it might do. Yeah, it might. That might well be the case. Yeah, we don't really know, do we? I mean, the planning system does allow for exceptions, and it will probably go on allowing for exceptions in some form or another, won't it? What it's saying is that you don't need another level of permission if you build according to the design guide, doesn't it? But that's not saying that you can't build something. You just have to get some kind of exceptional permission for it. And I have to admit, I don't know what that route is. So we don't yet know. We need more. We need to know much more, I think, about what the design guides will consist of. But the general idea behind it, which is that that areas can devise their own design guide, seems to me to be a good idea, I think.
Well, having skimmed through the extremely long draft version of the design code, there are bits of it which seem like a good idea and bits of it which seem far too prescriptive to me. Yeah,
I think prescriptive will turn out to be the mistake. That is one of the battle lines, isn't it? Because by and large, the traditionalists want it to be prescriptive. And no doubt it will be prescriptive in some places. But there's a whole country to build in. Not everything has to be the same everywhere, you know? I mean, if traditionally minded people in one particular area say, well, you can expand this town, but you have to do it like this, then that's going to be the answer there, but it's not necessarily going to be the answer at the next town or the next place. That might all be terrible, gross naivety on my point, because I haven't been through it. I mean, I have skimmed through model design guides and so on, but I have not really taken it all in yet, and it's difficult to say what it will be. But I don't think that it's like a wickedly intentioned thing, actually. Well, the problem is a different problem, isn't it? Which is that there has always been this myth about the place that people can't get permission to build enough houses, but that isn't the problem. They just don't build them for other reasons. There are lots of unfulfilled permissions all over the place, aren't there? Large amounts of land banking of permissions going on. There isn't the motivation for those contractors to build the houses they want to build in that area, so they just don't. That is more of a serious problem.
And do you think we'll ever get mass house builders building many houses of the quality that the Edwardians did?
We can always come back to it. I mean, English architecture is not good all the time, is it? Sometimes it isn't and sometimes it is, but it has on occasion produced buildings of staggeringly high quality, just as it has on certain decades produced buildings of mostly staggeringly uninteresting kind.
How long before the next Tudor revival?
The Tudor revival is always with us, Bruce. There's no shaking that off.
It never goes away.
Never goes away, no.
We can argue all day about whether that's a good or a bad thing. All right, Timothy Brittain-Catlin, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Good to speak to you.